Fume is not a vape, but it is a different way to break habits. With flavored air, you can satisfy your oral fixation through a passive diffusion system that utilizes no electronics, vapor, or combustion. Fume has served over 300,000 customers, and you can be the next success story. Head to tryfume.com. That's tryfum.com and use code SCARY or scan the QR code on screen to get a free gift with your order today.
Hi, witches. I'm Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week. The mere idea of summer fills many of us with nostalgia and anticipation. We look forward to those more carefree months of barbecues, camping trips, swimming, and just having fun. But each of those activities also come with a warning. Sometimes, often when we least expect it. It's not just fireworks that blow up in your face, and instead of a summer of fun, you're left with a lifetime of nightmares. First, an Independence Day legend, followed by an Australian creepy creek. Finally, in our last story, beware of Scottish campsites. Before we get to our stories, I wanted to ask if you would join our Patreon as a paying member. It's one of the ways you can help Something Scary continue to grow, and it only takes a minute. If you want more spooky podcasts, check out our Patreon, subscribe, and join other horror lovers like me. Thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful for all of the support of our listeners. Go to patreon.com/somethingscary. So, want to hear something scary? Fireworks, frights, and summer nights. A holiday is usually a time for celebration, for family and friends to come together and have fun. But sometimes a specific date can also hold terrifying memories that can be even worse if there is also unfinished business, as in this story inspired by Antonio. Tony had always wondered why his Uncle Lee hated July 4th so much. Each year, his family would host a huge barbecue, the adults enjoying burgers and beer and the kids playing in the pool until the sun set. Once the sun had set, they'd watch the amazing fireworks shows. Everyone was happy, carefree, enjoying the celebration except for Uncle Lee. The rest of the year, on other celebrations like birthdays and Christmas, he was the life and soul of the party. Every year, Tony asked his mom why Uncle Lee seemed upset. "Doesn't he like hot dogs?" Tony would say. "Or is it the music?" But his mom would just shoo him away and tell him not to bother with his uncle. But summer after Tony's senior year of high school, a storm had hit the town, postponing the 4th of July celebrations. Tony's house was still the venue for the family gathering, but only a handful of people braved the weather. His mom was cooking dinner when the power went out. In the end, the remaining guests set up in the den with takeout pizza and started telling stories about things they'd gotten up to as high school seniors. Tony hadn't heard these stories before and was fascinated to learn about his dad TPing the principal's office for senior pranks. One of the other adults mentioned something about Uncle Lee being on the football team. Tony leaned over to his uncle. "I didn't know you played football." For the first time, Uncle Lee seemed to want to talk. "Come with me," he replied, as he stood up and motioned for Tony to follow. He led him into the kitchen. "Have I got a story for you," he said. Back in high school, he played running back on the football team. On the 4th of July, he and a couple of friends from the team were walking home from a party. They stopped at a trench on the side of the road about a mile from his house. Local legend held that a tiny man with supernatural abilities lived in the trench. Tony listened in to his Uncle Lee in awe. He had never heard of this before. Lee continued that many years ago, a young man who had thrown rocks into the trench woke up the next morning with his right leg missing, amputated mysteriously in the night. There was also a story about a teen girl who didn't believe in the legend, so she stood at the head of the trench and cursed at it, taunting the so-called little man known as Red Boots. But the next morning, she woke up to find her tongue had been cut out. Tony's eyes widened as Lee shook his head and said, "Of course, we didn't really believe in the stories. At least not then." Knowing that he was the fastest runner on the team, one of his friends said, "Lee, I'll give you $100 if you go into the trench and run from end to end." Lee agreed. Besides, there wasn't really anyone going down there, was there? Lee made his way down the hill and tried to get a visual of the other end. "On your mark, get set, go." He bolted like a bullet, looking to left and right, watching how fast he was passing the bushes. His confidence was short-lived when he suddenly heard the rustling of bushes to his left. The sound as if someone or something was running through the bushes beside him, matching his exact pace. He began to think about all of the stories he heard about this trench. He was now very afraid to look to his left, but he mustered up the courage to do so. When he turned his head to the left, all he could see were a pair of glowing red boots, running as if they were trying to keep up with him. Lee began to run faster and faster, but to no avail. No matter how fast he ran, the glowing red boots maintained the same speed. All of a sudden, the boots took off and disappeared. He felt a slight feeling of relief when they disappeared, until he looked straight forward and saw the glowing red boots standing firm about 20 yards in front of him. He tried to bring himself to a stop, hoping to juke to the left or the right of whatever was in front of him, but as soon as he got closer, he could see the small man who was wearing the boots. He was about 2 feet tall, and his face was horribly scarred and disfigured. Frightened by the figure's appearance, Lee lost his footing, causing him to trip and fall hard to the ground. He looked up, almost sure that he would see red boots standing over him, but to his surprise, he was alone. Terrified, he quickly jumped to his feet and began running as fast as he possibly could to get to the other side of the trench. Suddenly, Lee felt a sharp pain in his right calf, and he fell to the ground once again. He quickly turned over to examine his leg and saw a small rusty blade had pierced his calf. He yelled out loudly as he struggled to pull the blade from his leg. Suddenly, red boots appeared again in front of him, and as the pain in Lee's leg intensified, the creature said,
"Now do you believe the stories?"
Tony looked at his uncle, his mouth wide open in horror. Lee continued. He made it to the end of the trench and climbed out as fast as he could. He told his friends what he'd seen, and to start with, they thought he was joking, until they saw the nasty gash on his leg. He limped home, wrapped his leg with an old t-shirt, and got into bed and covered his head, praying until he finally fell asleep. But the wound got infected, and the damage to his leg meant he could never run or play football again. He lost contact with his buddies and never ever went near that trench again. Lee was silent as he sipped his drink, letting the story register. Tony's eyes glanced down to Lee's leg. He was wearing shorts, and there it was, a large scar of the back of his left calf. "That's why I hate the 4th of July. And," Lee added, looking out of the kitchen window and across the large backyard, Old Red Boots Trench just happens to be at the very bottom of your property past the dumpsters. After the guests had all left, Tony took out the trash, only this time, he was a little nervous. As he edged towards the back gate, where the dumpster was, he thought he could hear a rustling sound. He quickly threw away the garbage, and just as he was about to rush back into the yard, saw a quick flash of red and heard a small voice. So quiet it was like an echo in the wind.
"I am still waiting."
Are there any local legends in your town? Has anyone from your family experienced them? What would you do if you knew red boots lived at the bottom of your backyard?
Have you heard that the flavored air category is quickly becoming the leading alternative to vaping and smoking? It's a whole new movement towards better habits led by the sponsor of today's video, Fume. Fume is not a vape, but it is a different way to break habits. With flavored air, you can satisfy your oral fixation through a passive diffusion system that utilizes no electronics, vapor, or combustion. I have been using my Fume, and I really love the flavor crisp mint. Fume has served over 300,000 customers, and you can be the next success story. For a limited time, use my code SCARY to get a free gift with your Journey Pack. Head to tryfume.com. That's tryfum.com and use code SCARY or scan the QR code on screen to get a free gift with your order today.
We might be celebrating American independence, but creepy summertime tales come from all over the globe. And when it gets super hot in Australia, cooling off in the creek might be just what you need. So as long as there aren't any unexpected guests, as in this story inspired by Olivia. The first time it happened, Flick was 6 years old. We lived in Brisbane, Australia, and around this time of year, it was so hot that Flick and the other neighborhood kids would grab their bathing suits, towels, and goggles and head down to the creek that was just outside the complex they all lived in. It was surrounded by trees and thick bushes, so they weren't allowed to go without adults or older kids around, since the creek wasn't visible enough for parents to look from afar. This particular time, some of the high schoolers came along to sunbathe and cool off in the cool creek. So despite her mom's initial reticence, Flick was allowed to go. She had recently got big round glasses for long-distance vision and was still getting used to them. Her mom made her promise not to lose them or leave them anywhere. Flick was chatting with her friend Alex when another of the neighborhood kids, Lewis, called from the creek, telling us to come see this cool thing he had found in the water. Flick and Alex hurried over, wondering what it could be. Lewis had a long stick in his hand, and he was prodding an old doll that was just sitting there in the shallowest part of the water. The doll looked really old, and Flick felt unsettled by its very presence. It wasn't like one of the baby dolls she had, or the Barbies her older cousins played with. No, this doll looked somehow like someone had made it, cursed it, and then tried to drown it. The head was made of porcelain, with a face intricately painted onto it, each feature delicate and creepy and creepily realistic. It had a dirty cloth body and limbs made of sticks. The thing that bothered Flick the most was its eyes, because no matter where Flick was, the doll seemed to be looking back at her, its eyes moving with her. Some of the older kids gathered around too, all poking at the doll with sticks until one was brave or stupid enough to pick it up. They started throwing the doll at one another, laughing and shrieking as they dodged it. Flick was terrified the thing might touch her. Even the thought of its strange floppy body or Blair Witch-type branch limbs making contact with her skin made her nauseous, so she moved further up the creek to try to enjoy a swim in the cool water. The intense heat had calmed the physical activity, and now the other kids sat in the cooling creek, making up stories about where the strange toy had come from. It was a lure, one said, designed to attract an inquisitive young child, and then bam, when they picked up the doll, a stranger would appear and steal them away, abducting them in his van so they'd never be seen again. "No!" cried one of the teens. It belonged to a child who'd been murdered, and they now roamed the creek looking for their doll, but never finding it. The stories were starting to frighten Flick, and she moved further down the creek and away from the others, trying her best to block out the chatter. Just as she rounded a corner now out of view, something brushed against her leg. The creek was fairly shallow and clear, and when she looked down, there was nothing there, no leaves or aquatic life to have touched her. Then she felt it again, and this time it was like a hand grasping her ankle. Screaming, Flick ran from the water to the nearest shore, sobbing. She called for someone, anyone, but the others either ignored her or she had swam too far. Just then, a girl who Flick had never seen before appeared and placed a hand on Flick's shoulder. Flick cried out, as the hand was like ice, which had shocked her since it was so extremely hot. Looking up, she felt the same unsettled feeling she had experienced when she had first seen the doll. The girl smiled, and something about her seemed oddly familiar, and Flick was about to ask who she was when she heard her mom yelling. Flick turned to see her running over, a concerned look on her face. but when Flick looked back to where the girl had been just seconds before, she'd vanished. Flick stared at the now empty space as it dawned on her who the girl had resembled. Although impossible, the girl's face had looked almost exactly like the one painted onto the doll. Flick was about to say something when her mom gasped. She'd lost her new glasses and banged up her knees. That, coupled with the fact she'd swam too far away from the older kids, resulted in Flick's mom banning her from swimming at the creek until she was old enough. The next time it happened, Flick was 16. Her family had moved away from the complex, and therefore the creek, a long time ago. It was summer, a typical damp and humid Australian summer, and Flick was on the couch, reading a book, listening to the patter of the raindrops. Her parents were both at work, so she was all alone. Her cat Coconut, a fluffy red-tailed ragdoll, sat against her side, purring softly. Flick should have been feeling rested and peaceful, but despite the quiet, she began to experience an unsettling feeling, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Suddenly, the power went out and the rain stopped, as if someone had turned off a tap. It was silent, too silent. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to the window to see if anything was going on outside that would have affected the power. Coconut started to hiss furiously, something the mild-mannered feline never did. Flick turned to look back at the cat and froze. Her book, which had been placed on the armrest of the couch, was now on the coffee table. Next to it were her old glasses, the ones she hadn't seen since she'd lost them 10 years ago. And next to them was the doll from the creek, with the face that had looked like the little girl who just vanished. Except the painted face had changed. It didn't look like that girl from the creek anymore from all those years ago. Instead, the doll's perfectly painted face now looked exactly like Flick. Would you touch a creepy doll you found? What would you do if you saw it again years later? Do you think this one would be locked up with Annabelle? Scottish Bones. Camping in the woods during summer is a rite of passage, a way to bond with your friends, to make memories that last a lifetime. The biggest horrors most of us face is hiding behind a tree to use a bathroom or getting bug bites that itch so bad you bleed. But sometimes those lifelong memories are very real nightmares, as in this story from Scotland inspired by Lucy. A few years ago, I decided to go camping with a group of friends before we all headed back to college. We didn't want to spend the whole weekend driving, so we chose a forest fairly local to us. It was a short walk from any civilization, but we'd all been camping before. We'd be fine. Even in Scotland, where we were used to the dreary weather, the sun sets much later during the summer months. So we set off around 5 p.m. It took over an hour as we were having such a laugh. By the time we got the spot where we planned to pitch the tents, it was around 6:30 p.m. Despite being in the middle of nowhere, the area was very popular. While heading to a camping spot, an old lady and her dog passed us. She saw our tents and bags and stopped us, and I remember so clearly what she said. "Please clean up everything and take your rubbish home. Someone keeps leaving bones just lying around. It's not good for the dogs. One of them will choke." And without waiting for a reply, she walked off again. Me and my friends just stopped and stared at each other for a minute or two. Then we just laughed about it. Who the hell would be leaving piles of bones around? Once we reached the campsite and pitched our tent, another hour had passed. We had picked a spot which was pretty difficult to reach to make sure that we wouldn't be disturbed when we all fell asleep, and so that we wouldn't get noise complaints if we wanted to stay up talking. We were sharing one big tent between us with a zip-up door which opened in the middle of it. We could unzip the waterproof entrance from the outside, but not the net entrance, and we threw down rugs and our sleeping bags just outside of it. The evening went on with us, just doing casual student things, cooking, singing, laughing, enjoying ourselves. The canopy of leaves on the trees made it much darker than it usually was. but we had a small fire going and a lot of flashlights. It was around 2 a.m. when most of us headed back inside the tent. My mate Danny started to feel sick and wanted to go home, so Kier accompanied him to the edge of the forest, waiting with him for someone to come pick him up. 2 of the girls wanted to sleep under the stars, so we put the sleeping bags just outside the tent flap. Me and the others were so tired, we all just crashed, surrounded by darkness and silence. I woke up to the sound of the zipper being slowly opened. It was pitch black and everyone else was fast asleep. I heard Kier shuffle back inside and felt his body slump down next to me. As I checked my phone to see the time, 5:30 a.m. What the hell? I was confused as to why he took so long to come back, but I didn't question it, and I didn't want to wake the others. It was a tight fit for all of us to lie down inside the tent, and Kier was really hot, the heat almost steaming off his body like a hot water bottle. He had his back towards me and was breathing really heavily. He smelled really weird too, like a damp animal smell. Eventually, I drifted off, listening to his snores, which was odd too. We'd shared a dorm room for the first year of college, and I never heard him snore before. In the morning, eating breakfast before we all packed, I said a sort of joke. "Kier, you smelled like crap when you came back into the tent beside me last night. What the hell had you been doing?" He just stared at me blankly, and then replied, "I didn't sleep next to you in the tent." I walked Danny halfway to the car park, where someone was picking him up, and then came back, but I stayed outside with the girls. One of the others who had been inside nodded. "Yeah, I had to let the 3 of them in around 7 a.m. I opened up the tent flap, looking at the space on the floor where I'd slept. Next to it was a still damp, dirty mark like something big had been there. It didn't make any sense. I rolled up my sleeping bag quickly and threw it into a backpack, wanting to get home as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Danny's mom. He never got home. He'd texted another mate to pick him up, but he wasn't there. We all went back to look for him, but his mom called the police. They searched, questioned us, nothing. Where could Danny be? We decided to return home so we could start looking again at sunrise. I dropped my rucksack on the floor and immediately the cat began to paw at it. Thinking the sleeping bag could probably do with a wash, I tipped it out onto the floor. It landed with a bang, and something bounced on the ground. Something that had no place being in my bag, and something that made me scream. Clump of wet animal hair and a human bone. I didn't tell the police about the strange snoring stranger in the tent. They'd never believe me anyway. Danny was never found. Not all of him anyway. A few days later, the old lady reported more bones in the forest after her dog brought her a tibia. The DNA matched with Danny. I'm not sure who or what was sleeping next to me that night, but every summer I tend to have nightmares about that trip. I never went camping again. And if I dare to even take a walk in those woods, I often feel like someone familiar is following me. Have you ever experienced something inexplicable while camping? Would you stay overnight in the woods if you knew something had happened there? What would you do if you found a human bone? This week's podcast stories were edited by Sarah Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris, additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman, produced by Ana Villalobos, executive produced by Gail Gilman, music by Sapphire Sindalo and Calvin Linderman.